Chapter 3, the Chichele Lectures on the conflict between East and West, delivered in Oxford on the 15th and 22nd May 1959. I had agreed in 1958 to give these lectures, and much of my time during the winter of 1958 to 1959 was spent in preparing them. I decided to make the first lecture historical, but only insofar as it was known to me. For this lecture, I had to carry out certain research, and the book in which I found most of what I needed was one written by Herbert Feis, F-E-I-S, a distinguished American, entitled Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, the War They Waged and the Peace They Sought. This is a magnificent study, and I would recommend it to anybody who wishes the best information on that subject. In the second lecture, I dealt with the post-war years, from 1945 up to the present time. The two lectures together constitute one balanced whole and should be read as such. My general conclusions will be found at the end of the second lecture. The reader should note that the first lecture was delivered 4 days after the foreign ministers gathered at Geneva, which was on the 11th May 1959. The second lecture, on the 22nd May, came when the foreign ministers had been talking for nearly 2 weeks, with no result. First lecture. The story up to the end of the Second World War, May 1945. This is a vast subject, and I imagine that historians will place the origins of the conflict at least as far back as the Battle of Marathon. But you gentlemen will know far more about that than I do. My best contribution to your thinking will be to confine myself to events in the military and political field of which I have some knowledge, in the hope that this may fill in gaps in your own study of the subject. In this first lecture, I will deal with the past, but only insofar as it is known to me. That will take us from the time of the First World War up to and including Hitler's war. You may think that this period is no longer as interesting as the period of the post-war troubles which now encompass the world. That may be true, but we must have some general background for our study. Then in the second lecture, we will examine how the conflict grew and developed during the post-war years, and try to discover why things in the world today are as they are. And to conclude, I will see if there is anything I can suggest which will provide a reasonable basis of thought and action in the dilemma in which we in this country, and indeed we of the West generally, find ourselves. If we are to plan the future wisely, we must learn from the past. As Maeterlinck said, "The past is of use to me as the eve of tomorrow. My soul wrestles with the future." Let us take a brief glance at the past. What has happened to our nation during the past 45 years? Twice during this period we have taken part in a world war. In the first one, the Kaiser's War, our empire casualties included 1 million dead. We won the war, but we made a sad mess of the peace. You will remember that the war propaganda took the line that it was a war to end war. The period after the war was one of great hankering after peace. It was also a period when there was a serious loss of belief in religious and moral principles, and a swing towards materialism as being the best way to achieve prosperity. In any case, we did not achieve prosperity, and during much of the 1920s and 1930s there was heavy unemployment. What is more, we did not achieve peace. Some 20 years after the end of the Kaiser's War, we became engaged in a Second World War, Hitler's War, and that before we had really recovered from the first. But worse was to come. As a nation, we were totally unprepared for the Second World War in 1939. However, in 1940, the grim realities of what we were fighting for were forced home to us, and we rose to the occasion, as the British always do in the end. But when, after some 4 years of Hitler's war, it became clear that in cooperation with our Russian and American allies, we were going to win, again, we lost sight of realities. The Grand Alliance of Nations began to break up, and the true intentions of Stalin began to disclose themselves. Later, after the war had ended, intense nationalism began to develop in areas which in the past were passive or subordinate, and the world began to drift towards this turbulence in which we find ourselves today. And to crown it all, once fear had disappeared, disunity began to appear in the Western ranks, thus making it more difficult than ever to hold our own against a centrally controlled communist East. Overall, then, in modern times we have had 2 major wars, both of them probably brought on by unpreparedness and, after each of them, a total failure to achieve the benefits which it was hoped and even promised that victory would bring. It is against this general background that I propose to examine the conflict. Since Russia, with her doctrine of international communism, is the root cause of all our troubles here in the West today, we should now cast back and see if we can discover when her motives began to create suspicion in Western circles. When the growth of fascism in Germany and Italy began to cause alarm in the West, the possibility of war loomed ahead. Conversations took place regarding collective action to restrain Hitler and Mussolini. The Russians professed a wish to take part in these talks, but Russian overtures were not accepted with any great eagerness. Their motives were mistrusted, and it would seem rightly so, because in August 1939 came the non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany. The ink had hardly come to dry on that pact before Stalin began to show his hand. He swallowed the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the eastern part of Poland, a portion of Finland, Bessarabia, Bukovina, and certain islands on the Danube. All these seizures of territory by Stalin took place when Russia was in association with Germany. Possibly they alarmed Hitler. Anyway, the association was always an uneasy one, and on the 22nd June 1941, Germany attacked Russia. This gave us a powerful ally. But Churchill, while gladly welcoming Russia as an ally, soon noted with some concern, if not surprise, that Stalin seemed to be at least as interested in post-war frontiers and spheres of influence as in prosecuting the war. Stalin thought he could hold the German onslaught until his bitter Russian winter set in. The spring of 1942 would be a critical time, but he considered that America would by then be in the war, after which final victory would be certain. 2 months after Russia had been invaded, that is, in August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill had met in Newfoundland and had signed the Atlantic Charter. This pledged the signatories to acquire no new territory and to oppose any territorial changes not agreeable to the peoples concerned. When the United States entered the war, 7th December 1941, its government proposed a Declaration of United Nations, binding all the governments at war with the Axis in an all-embracing war alliance, and also pledging them to support the principles of the Atlantic Charter. This was subscribed to by Soviet Russia and was signed on the 1st January 1942 in New York. Here at once were the seeds of discord. Despite their signature of the declaration, it was very clear that the Russians were going to insist on territorial claims which could not be reconciled with the principles of the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations Declaration. Both Roosevelt and Churchill were well aware of this attitude on the part of Stalin. Indeed, they had known about it in June 1941 when they decided to act in support of Russia. As the United States were not yet in the war, their support could only be by way of material supplies, and, in the view of the straits we were in, our aid would also have to take this form. Neither Roosevelt nor Churchill were disposed to bring into discussion Stalin's ambiguous position, or indeed to enter into unprofitable arguments which might cause the Russian war effort to slacken. As the German assault against Russia became intensified and more difficult to hold, so Stalin became more dissatisfied with the British war effort and the struggle against Germany and Italy. And he took no apparent interest in the Japanese threat in the Far East, which threat was causing Churchill considerable anxiety. Early in September 1941, even before the Americans came into the war, he made his first demand for a second land front to be opened in Europe by the British before the end of 1941, one which would draw 30 to 40 German divisions away from the Russian front. After the American entry into the war, this demand was to be repeated over and over again, and the question of when such a second land front could be opened was one which at times threatened to shake the alliance to its foundations. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th December 1941, America entered the war against both Germany and Japan. But all attempts to persuade Stalin to declare war on Japan met with a firm refusal. The United States Chiefs of Staff had always reckoned that sooner or later Japan would take some action which would bring America into the war. Even so, realizing that, they had come to the view that when the time came, the defeat of Germany must be the primary objective. But now we see, December 1941, Churchill becoming alarmed that the American people might fail to see the war as a whole, and might pursue the war against Japan in the Far East, leaving Britain to fight alone against Germany and Italy in the Western Europe, in Africa, and in the Middle East. There were indeed strong impulses tending to pull the American forces toward a major war effort in the Pacific. Against this, Stalin was urging the immediate opening of a second land front in Europe. However, at the first Great British-United States War Conference in Washington in January 1942, it was agreed that we defeat Germany first while containing Japan. Notwithstanding this clear agreement, we read in a book by an American historian that an effort of growing size and impetus was maintained in the Pacific. Also that the flow of troops and equipment to the Far East went on until August 1942, at least it was actually greater than across the Atlantic. The distribution of American military power was at times to cause alarm to the British Chiefs of Staff, and as a result, occasionally mistrust. We now come to a major point of thinking in the American military organization, which was to have a far-reaching effect on the conduct of the war. The Americans, once in the war, considered that all military actions must be based on purely military grounds and need not take into account their political repercussions. This thinking led to a postponement, for military reasons, of decisions about political issues. The eventual result was to leave the field of political action open to maneuver within the alliance, with the risk, indeed gradual growth, of suspicion. It was also a temptation for each member of the alliance to use its military strategy to pursue its own political aims. And it can be put forward with a certain justification that each, in fact, did so, in some degree. Russia fastening her grip on the continent of Europe, Britain always anxious about her position in the Mediterranean and about her lifeline to the Far East through the Suez Canal, while the United States looked longingly to the Pacific theater. This militarily unsound thinking, and remember I speak to you as a soldier, was to have serious results as the war progressed and, in my opinion, is responsible for certain of our troubles today. During 1942, two events of major importance tended to cause rifts in the alliance. The first one was the proposed treaty between Russia and Britain. Stalin wished to have Soviet frontiers dealt with in the treaty. Churchill was inclined to agree. He thought that the gravity of the war situation demanded that Russia should keep the frontiers she occupied when attacked by Germany in June 1941. Stalin was very steamed up on this issue, and Churchill reckoned that if Stalin was not given in the treaty, was not given in the treaty the frontiers he demanded. It might affect the Russian war effort. Roosevelt was entirely opposed to any discussion of frontier problems until the fighting was over. He tried to lure Russia away from her insistence on the immediate discussion of post-war frontiers by promising quick military relief, the opening of a second front in 1942, which was of course not possible so far as Western Europe was concerned. In the end, the Treaty of Alliance between Britain and Russia was signed on the 26th May, 1942, all provisions regarding the territories and post-war frontiers being omitted. Stalin had given way on the strength of what he had no doubt regarded as a promise of a second front in Europe in 1942. The second event of major importance was the argument which developed between the Americans and the British about where the second front should be, whether it should take place across the Channel in 1942 or in 1943, or whether the Allied forces should land in North Africa in 1942 and exploit the situation in the Mediterranean first. On this issue, there was a tremendous difference of opinion and contest of wills. Early in 1942, the planners in Washington, who included General Eisenhower, prepared plans for the cross-channel operation in 1942. A limited beachhead was to be seized in France in 1942, Operation Sledgehammer. In 1943 was to come the breakout from this bridgehead, Operation Roundup, and the all-out drive to Berlin to defeat Germany. Up to this time, the Americans had never fought the Germans in the Second War, and they had no conception of what a formidable enemy they were. In my opinion, the American plan for the cross-channel invasion of France in 1942 would have involved the Allies in a disaster which would have prolonged the war for years. The Americans wished to meet the giant German strength and to smash it in a decisive effort before all else, and then turn all their own great strength against the treacherous Japanese. The British wished to postpone the stern encounter until the German strength had been worn down by continual bombing. Her Italian ally had been knocked out of the war, and she was threatened from the Mediterranean side. The knockout blow would then be delivered following an invasion of Normandy. To my mind, the British strategy was sounder of the two. Anyhow, the British rejected the American plan for a cross-channel operation in 1942. The conquest of North Africa and Sicily and the invasion of Italy followed. The Quebec Conference in August 1943 agreed the cross-channel invasion of Western Europe for May 1944. The Russians were not represented in Quebec, and therefore this decision had to be conveyed to Stalin. No easy task. The operation had been first half promised to Molotov for 1942 by both Roosevelt and Churchill, then hinted at for 1943 at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, and in August 1943 definitely postponed until 1944. I suggest that, even at the risk of some repetition, before proceeding further in our study, we ought to take a quick look at the relationship which had grown up during the war between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. It always seemed to me that the Americans never realized that the British Empire had fought alone for nearly 2 years against the combined might of the Axis powers before the United States ever entered the war. The British people bore unaided the full weight of the contest in its initial stages and suffered accordingly. Other nations had either been struck down or looked on at the conflict from the touchline. Roosevelt worked hard to get the United States into the war, with only limited success. It is not easy to unify the great American nation on a specific issue. It was the Japanese who finally did it for him. Their action at Pearl Harbor unified the Americans in a few minutes. The great aim of the American Chiefs of Staff then was to concentrate all available forces for a cross-channel invasion of France, and to smash Germany by a decisive blow in 1942, only 6 months after they had entered the war, so that they could then turn their great strength against Japan. Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff knew better. And they were right. When the American army went into battle for the first time in the European theater in North Africa in November 1942, 1 year after they had entered the war, the troops were found to be very green. Churchill and his military advisers knew they could never be sufficiently battle-worthy to play their part in Europe against the full might of the German army in 1942, or even in the summer of 1943. This became a major cause of argument. And, of course, Stalin backed the American view. He wanted a second land front in Western Europe in 1941, if possible, and certainly in 1942. He did not mind how many Americans were killed. We did. So the controversy, at times, rocked the whole alliance. Stalin was always inclined to underestimate the British war effort before Russia came into the war. Otherwise, he would not have called for a second land front in Europe in 1941. He told me in 1947 that he had never had any doubts about the final defeat of Germany once the United States entered the war. It is therefore easy to understand that his main preoccupation was to grab as much territory as possible on his western frontier before Russia became engaged in the war, which he reckoned was bound to happen in the end, and to fasten his grip still further on Eastern Europe once victory became certain. Roosevelt and Churchill were both fully alive to this. Roosevelt reckoned all questions of frontiers could be handled at the peace conference when the fighting stopped. Churchill knew better, but he wasn't prepared to embark on arguments about frontiers if such arguments were likely to cause Russia to let up on her war effort. The British military situation in 1941 and the early days of 1942 was desperate, and he wanted the maximum effort from the Russians. It is interesting to note how Roosevelt and Churchill each tried to woo Stalin in his own way. Each often wanted a good talk with Stalin alone. Each was somewhat suspicious of the other seeing Stalin alone. So in this trio of war leaders, each a giant in his own nation, and each a determined personality, there was bound to be friction and disagreement. Overall, the trumps were held by Stalin, and the other two knew it. Let us now turn to January 1943, the time of the Casablanca Conference, at which the momentous decision was taken to impose unconditional surrender on Germany. Stalin did not attend the conference. The decision was taken by Roosevelt and Churchill and communicated to Stalin, who of course agreed since it suited his plans to the letter, as we shall see. It is commonly thought that Roosevelt's announcement at a press conference at Casablanca on the 24th January 1943 that the Allies would impose unconditional surrender on Germany, Italy, and Japan was made on a sudden impulse, that he had not thought about it earlier. This is not the case. In the spring of 1942, a committee in Washington had been studying end-of-war problems and had been impressed by the situation at the end of Kaiser's War, when there had been an armistice only, and Germany had not been required to submit unconditionally. This faulty decision had been, they reckoned, directly responsible for the Second World War. The committee recommended this time the imposition of unconditional surrender. It was never made clear what was meant by the statement. Did it mean that governments were to surrender their whole nations? And would there be governments anyway? Or was it to be merely the unconditional surrender of the armed forces? Anyway, or anyhow, Roosevelt had been considering the problem for some time in his own mind, and when he announced it at the press conference, Churchill spoke in agreement. I have often wondered whether Roosevelt had realized the full political repercussions of the decision he announced. It must mean that the Germans would fight to the last, that the British and American forces would meet the Russians in the middle of Germany, that there would then be no German government to deal with. In that event, unconditional surrender by whom? It is very plain to me that at this time Churchill was deeply concerned with the many political problems which must arise as the British, American, and Russian forces moved on and finally met in the middle of Europe. He had wanted to take his foreign secretary, Eden, with him to Casablanca, but Roosevelt asked that there should be no Foreign Office or State Department representatives present. Against his own better judgment, Churchill had agreed. The Casablanca Conference was held at a most important time. The end of the war in Africa was in sight. The Germans were in difficulties on the Russian front. Plans were being made to knock Italy out of the war. In fact, the final victory of the Allies was now certain. It was merely a question of when that would be. Tremendous political issues were going to arise during 1943, particularly in Italy, and as the Russian forces moved westwards, the Balkan states would once again come into the political arena. If foreign secretaries had been present at Casablanca, I find it hard to believe that all these vital issues would have been disregarded. At any rate, the pros and cons would have been fully discussed before the decisions were taken. Nations go to war for political reasons. When it is clear you are going to win, political decisions become paramount. It is then essential so to direct the operations that you end the war with the political balance favorable to win the peace. The Clausewitz doctrine that war follows peace operates also in reverse. Peace follows war. Understanding what must follow from the decision of unconditional surrender, and knowing that great troubles lay ahead with Stalin over Eastern Europe and the future of Germany, the Western Allies should surely have ensured that their forces gained possession of the great political centers of Central Europe before the Russians, notably Berlin, Prague, Vienna. If this had been laid down as the object by Roosevelt and Churchill in January 1943, in my considerable view as a soldier, we could have grabbed all three in 1944 before the Russians. But it was not laid down. And it may well be that Roosevelt and his military advisers would not have agreed. They reckoned all political issues should be left for discussion till the fighting was over. First win, then argue. I reckon you should decide what you want to win. Then maybe you needn't argue anyway. It must, of course, be remembered that the European Advisory Committee had, during 1944, worked out zones of occupation for the Allied forces in Germany when the war ended. The Russians naturally wanted the western border of their zone to be as far west as they could get it, and in the committee they had agreed with the British a western boundary substantially the same as their present zone. The Americans didn't seem to bother much about it. Indeed, Roosevelt initially didn't want the United States to have a zone at all, and intended to get the American forces back to the USA as soon as possible after the defeat of Germany. It is interesting to note how, at this period, neither the British nor the Americans seemed in any way upset at having the Russian army as far west in Germany as had been agreed in the plan put forward by the EAC. Roosevelt reckoned that by patience and friendliness the Russians could be guided to our way of thinking, and that he, Roosevelt, could bring this about. He liked to assume the role of a mediator between the British and Russians when the argument became heated, as for instance over Poland. But Churchill's thinking was very different. Before the Yalta Conference of February 1945, we find Churchill telling Roosevelt that the end of the war may well prove to be more disappointing than was the last. Then during the conference itself, the atmosphere was friendly, and it seemed that the Russians might well become reasonable partners in the post-war years. But this feeling of trust gave way to suspicion very soon after the Yalta Conference ended, when Stalin began to take the necessary steps to ensure that the whole of Eastern and Central Europe would be ruled by governments under the control of Moscow. Even the American government was now disturbed. Churchill was, of course, deeply distressed. He had failed to get the American government to understand that Soviet Russia had become a mortal danger to the free world. He has since written in Triumph and Tragedy, page 456, "Thus the climax of apparently measureless success was to me a most unhappy time. I moved amid cheering crowds, or sat at a table adorned with congratulations and blessings from every part of the Grand Alliance, with an aching heart and a mind oppressed with forebodings." How right he was, and how right on this score he had been all through. And so, as the German war was being won, we see the gradual loosening of the alliance. And then, when the war was over, Stalin was able to resume his revolutionary aims of world domination by the onward march of international communism, and this finally broke the alliance. Could it all have been avoided? Historians will argue the toss for many years, and will find the subject a happy hunting ground. Let us consider British and American relations first. I reckon history will record that Roosevelt and his advisers were generally suspicious of Churchill's motives. A celebrated American who was sent by Truman as a special envoy to see Churchill in May 1945 is said to have reported as follows. The Prime Minister is a very great man, but there was no doubt that he is, first, last, and all the time, a great Englishman. I could not escape the impression that he was basically more concerned over preserving England's position in Europe than in preserving peace. In any event, he had convinced himself that by serving England he was serving peace. The chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff is reported to have made the following comment on this statement. This was consistent with our staff estimate of Churchill's attitude throughout the war. I disagree with these expressions of opinion. My own personal relationship with Winston Churchill finds no evidence to support such statements. The authors seem to forget that if Britain had not stood firm in 1940 under her great leader, when all seemed lost, the situation in the United States today would be vastly different. They forget that America declined to take part in the fight for freedom until she herself was directly attacked. By standing firm when all seemed lost, the British people, under Churchill, saved Western civilization. I have always considered that while the breakup of the alliance into East versus West could hardly have been prevented, the Western nations could have ended the war with their forces further to the east than actually happened. They would then have been in a better position to achieve a political balance in Europe more favorable to themselves than that which has actually emerged, and Berlin might well have been included in the Western zones. As it was, when the British and American forces met the Russians in the middle of Germany, they had to withdraw a considerable distance to their own zones because they could not go back on their pledged word about zonal boundaries given at Yalta. But to achieve the desired end, political considerations would have had to be given their proper place in the planning once it was clear we were going to win the war. Knowing the troubles which lay ahead with the Russians, the Western nations should have ensured that they would be well placed politically vis-a-vis the Russians when the fighting stopped. To achieve success in these respects, the proper decisions would have had to be taken early in 1943, in fact, immediately after the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The final conference being between the Big Three took place at Yalta in February 1945. The bargaining power of the British and Americans at that conference was not very great. The early days of 1945 saw the Western Front reeling from a terrific German blow in the Ardennes. That battle in the Ardennes caused the Western Allies to lose 6 weeks in time with all that entailed in political consequences for post-war Europe. A study of the Yalta Conference will reveal that while the three leaders parted with expressions of eternal friendship, agreement on the more urgent problems of post-war Europe was not reached. Final victory began to come closer soon after the conference broke up, but as it came closer, arguments over the vital issues became more inflammatory. Stalin remained suspicious of American and British attempts to maintain spheres of influence in the Balkans or any other areas near the Russian frontiers. It was clear to all that Stalin was not going to hold to vows he seemed to have made when the going was bad. 15 May 1959.